So let me give you background. For those who don't actually know Karl, I'll just give you a background to him. Because Karl is editor, publishing director of Farmers Weekly at MA Agriculture, the Mark Allen Group, MAG. He has some pretty positive comments. He has an excellent reputation. And I'll just read a couple of comments that I read on LinkedIn, apart from the slightly rude one that I've just read, because it's relevant to what Karl's going to talk about tonight. And Karl was among the first to understand the extent to which skills and attitudes in journalism needed to adapt to the online and social media world. Today, Karl understands better than anyone I know, the writer of this, how journalism can benefit from a blend of traditional skills and the underlying developments and tools of recent years. I always found Karl clear thinking. You know, I think we're all waiting with great interest to hear Karl's input in tonight's presentation. And then I'm going to move straight on to Mark, and Mark Allen, of course. And Mark, of course, is the founder and chairman of Mark Allen Group, MAG or MAG. I'm not sure, Mark, how you prefer it to be called. When I looked this up, because it's already a substantial, diverse organisation, so I think we'll benefit from Mark's comments tonight. As of the end, before he acquired Farmers Weekly, he employed over 430 staff, and the company has rapidly expanded over the last decade. His company at the end of 2019 owned 100 magazines in 12 different sectors, and he was operating, and this is obviously before COVID would have limited a lot of things, 250 events, exhibitions and awards each year. When Mark acquired Farmers Weekly, he said, "This really is a dream come true for me. I grew up in Somerset and my father worked daily with farmers, so I know Farmers Weekly very well. When I worked for RBI many years ago, Farmers Weekly was regarded as the very top of the publishing mountain. I can't believe it is coming home, so to speak. It represents the summit of our acquisition strategy." Mark, we're very interested to hear about your plans and future strategy for Farmers Weekly. It's obviously in very safe hands. So having given that introduction to both of you, I'm not sure which of you is speaking to, but if I can ask you to work that out between yourselves and I'll hand over to you. The only thing is questions. If you could let us know how you'd like questions to be asked, whether you'd like people to ask them as you go, or whether you'd like them to put the questions on chat and we'll ask them at the end. How would you prefer that to be handled?
I don't really mind. Probably at the end, I think it's probably easier with Zoom, but I'm very receptive. If anyone wants to butt in, please feel free to do so.
Okay. And meanwhile, I'll watch chat, and if there are any chat questions at the very end, I'll file them off at both Mark and Karl, just to make sure everybody's happy. One little bit of business, if we could all make sure we're muted, please, during the presentation, unless you are actually asking questions. Thank you.
Mark, I'm happy to defer to you to go first.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Karl. That's kind of you. Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed, Paul, for that generous introduction, and many congratulations to Rachel for becoming the chair, and also to Tim becoming the vice chair, the chair of vice, as you like, and also to Liz for inviting me today. I've heard some really excellent reports about the Midlands Guild, and I can see why you're such a lively and dynamic and a charming group of people. So as Liz said, would I consider being a member of your excellent guild? And I can assure you that I'd be very proud and privileged to become a member, if you feel that I'm worthy of such a kind of an honour. So it's certainly been very nice to chat to Liz, and it's one of those things where just talking to Liz, I feel that I've becoming a friend over one conversation. And in fact, I've just recently become a member of the Farmers Club, and one of the first people I will invite is Liz to be my companion there. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. As I say, it's really is a real huge pleasure and privilege to be the owner of Farmers Weekly, and Paul's taken half my script, I suppose, but I just want to really tell you a little bit about my kind of background. I grew up in deeper Somerset, and my father was a concrete manufacturer dealing with farmers all the time. So my father thought the world of farmers. He used to think they were the absolute salt of the earth. And so I grew up knowing farmers. I don't think I can lay claim to ever having properly milked a cow or driven a tractor, but I certainly know a lot of farmers. And during the holidays, I would help my father when he was erecting kind of sheds, and I would meet an awful lot of farmers. So as I say, I grew up in a little place called Castle Carey. I don't know if anyone knows it. And at that stage, it was surrounded by lots of farms, dairy farms, mainly. And so I've sort of I know farmers sort of fairly well. So when I was growing up, my father, there were two magazines that he took regularly, that he read religiously. As an engineer, sorry, there's a bit of interruption coming through. Can everyone hear me, by the way? There's someone actually talking above, but anyway, there was my father as an engineer. There are two magazines that he took religiously. One was the Engineer, and the other one was Farmers Weekly, and he used to read Farmers Weekly every single week. Now, to my mind, so he really admired Farmers Weekly. I absolutely loved farmers. The idea of me one day owning Farmers Weekly just seemed to be kind of completely incredible. I never ever thought that this would ever come to pass, but it did. And actually, I'm really delighted, as I say, to have become the owner. Farmers Weekly was ever present in my household. And, obviously farmers were very much part of my kind of social scene. I got to know a lot of farmers or their children. I was often on farms. So I think, although, as I say, I don't have too many practical skills, I think I know what makes farmers tick. And I've got a huge admiration of farmers, which obviously partly passed on by my father, but also having known a lot. And what I really like about farmers, and I suppose every group you have to generalize, and there's obviously a lot of variety in farmers, but what I admire greatly about farmers is that where you stand with them. They're very honest people. On the whole, they're extremely honest people, and they call a spade a spade. They give their views fairly forcefully at time, but they also are very good social animals. A lot of them, not all of them, because farming can be an isolating profession. If you're driving a tractor all day, so things like suicide rates are very high in farming, as we all know. But I really admire farmers and admire what they do, and I think that during this pandemic, we've all clapped our hands with nurses and healthcare professionals, but I also feel that we ought to clap our hands loudly in what the contribution, the understated contribution that farmers have made. The farmers, they're the people who've actually made certain that food has been delivered to the supermarkets and all the shops, and I think they deserve, a great deal of thanks from all of us for actually doing that. So, when I was at school, my closest friend, who was the head boy at school, who is a very bright guy, he actually went to Cambridge to read agriculture. In those days, you could read agriculture as well as land economy. He's got a degree in agriculture at Cambridge, and then he became a farmer. And because he didn't come from a very wealthy background, that there was, none of his kind of ancestors owned a farm, and he became, and all his life was a tenant farmer, and farming down in sort of Devon, so where he farmed all over the place. But his last resting place, he's now retired. He's got a small holding still, but he farmed down in near Crediton in Devon, and he completely and utterly transformed, that farm. It was a mixed farm. He's a great lover of sheep, but he's also, is arable as well. So he did a tremendous job, and in very unfertile terrain, to really kind of transform it over the kind of over the years. And he did an absolutely brilliant job. And I used to kind of feel, often I'd sort of turn up when he was in the beginning. I'd turn up in my smart car and talk to him, spend the weekend with him and his wife, and they practice what they preach. So they completely live off the land. They're very contented people. They've got no great aspirations. And, when he was starting the farm, he once said to me, do you know have a guess how much I've earned in the last year? So I said, I've got no idea, and he said, well, I tell you how much I've earned the last year. I've earned £6,000. And I was quite shocked. But there's no, the fact that, I turned up as a friend, he wouldn't have swapped places with me one iota. He was very proud of what he did, very self-sufficient, didn't have great kind of demands or anything. So he's just an absolutely wonderful person, and my closest friend at school. I then, as Paul sort of said in his intro, so I kind of just a brief sketch over my life. After school, I went to school, then I went to university in Durham, and I decided to become a kind of a journalist. And I sort of, worked on a local newspaper, an evening newspaper in Sheffield, and then I worked on a national newspaper, the Daily Express for my sins in Manchester. And then in the 70s, when I've always been kind of quite interested in lots of different things, but including kind of social issues, and Reed RBI was launching a weekly magazine for social policy, social workers, and I applied for this job, and I was only 26, 27 at the time, and I applied for an application form, and it said, I ticked every single job that was going. Do you want to be the editor? Yes. Deputy editor? Yes. Features editor? Yes. Production editor? Yes. Sub editor? Yes. And so I ticked every single job that was going, and I was looking for other jobs as well at that time. I'd been on the Daily Express for 3 years, but I wanted to make a move, although I was happy there. And then I was invited down for an interview, and I kind of went down to the interview. It seemed to go sort of quite well, and then I was invited back for another interview, and I didn't know quite who I was being interviewed by. And anyway, he had a rather sort of simplistic way of asking kind of questions. So, he had a list of questions he would ask me, and he said, right, age, 26, where do you live? So I told him, do you mind coming down to London? No, so anyway, that was his style of interviewing. It was very direct to the point. And then right at the end of the interview, he said, right, he said, you've got the job. So I said, well, which job? Having applied for every single job. He said, I've been interviewing for the editorship. You're the editor of Community Care. And so I became the editor of Community Care, which, again, very strangely enough, I now have bought back from Reed. It's now different propositions. It's an online tool for social workers. I bought that back. So I became the editor of Community Care, and it became very successful. The magazine won various awards and did pretty well. But while I was at Reed, one of my friends there, and still is a very good friend of mine, and some of you may know him, became the editor of Farmers Weekly, someone called Dennis Chamberlain, and who lives in Northamptonshire, and his wife Annie. Both of them, she was became the news editor. So Dennis was the editor and left, and there's some kind of issue, I don't know what. Anyway, he left, and he's still a very good friend of mine. Annie's still a very good friend. He was a person who nominated me for the Farmers Club, he and Annie, so I've now become a member of the Farmers Club. I have to say one thing that about them, that they invited me. Of course, Annie's comes from a farm, like Liz, like a lot of people. They have a big farm. Her family's got a farm up in sort of Scotland. They invited me to stay, and I went up with my wife and my children, and my son now, Ben, who was the son is now the chief executive officer of the company. He was then, I don't know, about 6, 7 or 8 or whatever it was, not very old. And the first day we arrived, and they had this big kind of sheepdog outside the farm, and they went up. My son zoomed over to him and started to stroke the dog, and the dog leapt up at him and bit his nose practically off. So the first thing we had to do was quickly take him to the emergency accident emergency hospital at the local hospital, and get his kind of nose sewn up. It was sort of virtually hanging off. So, but funnily enough, my son can't remember that. To me, it was very clear, and so it's something that occasionally I bring out with Dennis and Annie, that if the chips are down. But I mean, actually, there's no problem. They were incredibly professional about it. They actually they had to let the dog go. But that's just a little kind of anecdote. So anyway, what I'm really saying in this sort of cack-handed way is that I've seemed to be at every stage of my life, farming or the farming community seems to kind of resonate with me and comes back, and not really ever thinking. I mean, I never thought that acquiring Farmers Weekly was ever going to be in my kind of league. And then just fast forward a few years, in 1985, I started my own company, and with 2 medical journals, which I bought off. I'd left Reed by then, which I was very happy at Reed, and I joined a company called Thomson. Some of you may know it. We used to own the Times newspaper, but they had a publishing arm, a magazine publishing arm. So I joined them. I wasn't there very long, and after about a year, I decided to do a management buyout. I bought 2 of the magazines that I was then responsible for, and set up my own company. It was a 1-man and a dog operation, and very little money. But we managed to slowly but surely kind of just build it up by, I started launching quite a lot of very niche healthcare products, and little by little we started developing the company. And then about 12 years ago, I suppose, we started to put our head above the radar. We've always been kind of fairly kind of low maintenance up to then, and we then started to develop the company mainly by acquisition. So we started to say that we are publishers, we've got transferable skills, we can actually publish in any kind of markets. And a lot of the bigger companies, like Reed, like Haymarket, were sort of disposing of some of the really good sort of brands. So, I decided that we were going to get outside the medical market that we were then mainly involved with and to expand outwards. So I started buying off a lot of different magazines in different sort of markets where I could see that there were kind of opportunities. So, we bought some really market leading brands. So I bought from Reed for Relics Community Care, which I now have, which is doing incredibly well. I bought from Haymarket the Gramophone. I'm a music fan, and that's an iconic sort of music brand launched in 1923. And again, that's a great acquisition for us. And last year, I bought back from Centaur the Engineer. So, and then suddenly, out of the blue, I was invited to tender for Farmers Weekly, and and I was absolutely determined. If there was one magazine that I wanted to win, it was Farmers Weekly. So it's a fairly, as Karl will know, it was a competitive pitch, but we gave it our all, and we were very fortunate very fortunate to become the preferred bidder. We won the pitch to own kind of Farmers Weekly, and it's been an absolutely brilliant acquisition for us because, as everyone knows, I mean, Farmers Weekly, I know some of you have got roots in Farmers Guardian, if I can sort of, but Farmers Weekly is the market leader. There's no question about that. It's got 26,000 subscribers. It's an incredibly successful publication. In the past, I think it owns 3 or 4 different farms. It doesn't own any farms now, but it's been a fantastic acquisition for us, particularly having acquired it in February, just before COVID-19 and this dreadful kind of pandemic. Because what's happened with Farmers Weekly is that it's been barely affected by the pandemic. It's just seemed to sail through, regardless. Subscriptions have maintained very strong levels. Advertising has been very buoyant. Display advertising has been very buoyant, and it's been beautifully managed by Karl and his team, and it's been fantastic for us. So our company, despite all the problems we have with kind of the pandemic, it finds itself in tremendous heart, really. I think more than most other media companies, we've actually broken the mold. We've actually doing extremely well, and I don't mind giving kind of figures. I mean, if you look at our current accounts, you'll see that our 2019 accounts show that the latest ones, we turned over about 51 million, and we made an EBITDA of 8.6 million, 8.6 million, and net profits of 6.6 million. And this year that we're in, that the turnover will come down because obviously we haven't been able to run events which contribute something like a third of all our revenue. We haven't been able. We do in a pre-COVID year something like 250 different events, exhibitions, small events, awards. In a non-COVID year, we'd be turning over, they would be turning over 13, 14, 15 million events alone. So we haven't been able to do a single live event. But despite all this, sort of turnover will come down to about 45 million. But our actual kind of EBITDA profit will go up around 9.5 to 10 million pounds, and we've achieved that with all the problems. So that will be a record year, and a lot of that contribution, or a major part of that contribution will come from Farmers Weekly. So as I say, it's been a tremendous kind of gift for us to have. So, finally, how do I see, and Karl will elaborate on this, and he's in a much better position than I am to do this, but how do I see the future of Farmers Weekly? How I see Farmers Weekly is doing what it's doing at the moment, in that it is the kind of the farmer's friend. It supports them. It's sometimes critical. It's a critical voice, but a very supportive voice. What we are interested in terms of our editorial profile is producing, developing actionable content which make a difference to the performance and the lives of farmers. And on the whole, those tend to be progressive farmers who want to develop their businesses and to adapt and to adopt with kind of new technology and progressive thinking about the whole agricultural business. And so that's really where Farmers Weekly has positioned itself under Karl's magnificent leadership. And so we will be doing more and more of that. We want to develop the brand even more. The area which I think you'll see us developing into, particularly if and when we can get over this pandemic, we will want to expand in terms of our events portfolio, whether that's in live events or niche driven, content driven events that we will, that obviously we're all kind of doing. So I think Farmers Weekly has got a magnificent future. I'm one of those people, so a lot of publishers are really exercised about, should we be online, should we be print, is print sort of a bit of a dinosaur thing to be involved with. Well, give me dinosaurs any day. There's 26,000 dinosaurs, if you like, with Farmers Weekly, and we will cherish them and respect them. But I'm agnostic about what is a delivery system. If people want online, it's our job to ensure that they can have online. If they want to go on having it in print, we'll make certain they will kind of get it in print. So I'm completely agnostic about what the mix is going to be. We as a publisher, our job is to serve what our readers, our advertisers, our marketeers want, and whatever that is, we'll try to honour that. So I'm very, very excited. I'm getting on in years, but Farmers Weekly has given me a completely new kind of lease of life. And, I'm here to try to do whatever I can to see that we build even further, if we can, on the great foundation that Farmers Weekly has, and to see if we can develop it even more, go into events. So we'll be looking to acquire things, in the agricultural stable, whether that's new magazines, online offerings, new data opportunities, or events. So finally, and very sadly, I have to say this, because Karl, who I can't praise enough for being the kind of, he's really helped with the whole transition of Farmers Weekly into our stable. I can't praise him enough for doing that. Now, very sadly, Karl, and perhaps it's better coming from him, but I thought I should say it, that Karl has decided to take kind of early retirement in April. So he will be leaving the fold at the end of March. That's a great disappointment, but I totally respect Karl's wishes. He's got his own sort of personal reason. I don't think there's anything to do with me. I think we've got a very, very good relationship, but you can ask him. I think he's got his own personal. So we will be looking, and we've already advertised for a new kind of editor. So if anyone here has got the skills or knows of anyone who has got the skills to become, to my mind, it's probably the best job in in publishing, to be the next editor of Farmers Weekly, then please let me know. You know, as far as I'm concerned, we're looking for a very, very accomplished journalist who can lead quite a big team, and ideally someone who's got a very solid, good kind of you know, farming background. Doesn't have to be, but basically, you know, if someone's got a good sort of background in agriculture, farming, brought up in a farm, or knows a lot about the industry, then that's so much the better. So on this note, I will hand over to Karl, and he will, I think, fill in the blanks, talk about himself a little bit, talk about the role with Brexit and the agricultural bill. But I just want to say, you know, I'm delighted to be part of this, you know, incredibly delightful and dynamic gathering. And if there's anything that I can do to help the Guild, then I will be very pleased to do so. So on that note, let me hand over to, you know, the remarkable Karl, who, as I say, I'm full of admiration and praise for him, and I'm only disappointed that I won't have very much longer to work with him, but it's been a delight to do so, and I can't praise him highly enough. So over to Karl.
Thanks very much, Mark, for those kind words. I better start by just underlining it's absolutely nothing to do with Mark or the move to Mark Allen Group that has prompted me to leave. I promised myself and my wife, actually, many years ago, that I would retire before I reached 60. And it's actually a tribute to the fact that I've enjoyed my job so much that I'm really going to get close to the wire. I'll be 59 when I finally do retire. So I've got almost to my deadline before going. But I think it's a good time now to go. You know, as Mark said, we've gone through the transition from Reed to Mark Allen Group. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. You know, we've also established the team's working brilliantly under the current circumstances. You know, the way they've managed to cope with everyone working from home at very, very short notice is absolutely remarkable, and the numbers back up the fact that the team's working incredibly well. So I'm really confident that I'm leaving a ship that, frankly, probably won't even miss me when I go. It's such a well-run operation. I get all the glory at the top, but actually there's a team of fabulous people underneath who the best team in business publishing, without a doubt. Mark told the story about when he was bidding for Farmers Weekly, and it was a very competitive process, and I led the Farmers Weekly team that sort of did all the presentations to the various potential buyers. And one thing that stood out absolutely with Mark Allen Group, and Mark in particular, was the passion for Farmers Weekly in the industry, and that you can't underestimate that made a huge difference. And certainly it's gone down really well with the Farmers Weekly team, you know, and the fact that until, you know, so it was very unfortunate that the lockdown came about a month after or just over a month after we joined Mark Allen Group. But the fact that Mark, you know, on several occasions wandered around the office and was talking to the editorial team and just showed a real genuine interest in what we were doing. You know, having just come from a company, RBI, which when I joined it was a publishing company in the 1980s, but by the time we were sold, definitely wasn't a publishing company. We were I think we were the second to last magazine. They've still got one left. And it was a very, very different business. And it was just so nice to be back in a company that cares about publishing, that loves magazines. And it reminded me, actually, in many ways, about my early days at RBI. And I have to say, Mark is does come from an editorial background. He's pretty insightful. He did a couple of reviews of the magazine not long after we sort of moved over to Mark Allen Group, and I read them and I thought, bloody hell, I can't pull the wool over this chap's eyes. He actually knows what he's talking about. You know, he from, you know, not that sort of long an acquaintance with the publication. He had some pretty insightful views, and I actually shared them with the entire team. And feedback was, you know, he wasn't all, he didn't only say nice things about us. He said some, you know, there were a few things he thought we could improve, and we had to look at them and say, yeah, you know, these are things that we recognise, areas we can improve as well. So, but it's really nice to be part of a publishing company. So I'm going to just talk about three things very briefly. I'll talk a little bit about sort of set the scene, state of the nation, how I see UK farming today, because at the end of the day, what we're doing our starting point has to be the market we're serving, the audience we're serving, what's going on, because that drives what we need to do to be a successful magazine. I think Liz wanted me to say a little bit about sort of Brexit and the Ag Bill, so I'll say sort of that naturally leads into sort of a little bit about Brexit and the Ag Bill, and then a bit about Farmers Weekly, what we're doing, some of our priorities, and how we're working under COVID and how that's changed some of the things we work. I won't spend a long time on the sort of British farming, because I know I'm talking to an audience that in most cases knows a heck of a lot more about British farming than I do, actually. But I have to say, the first thing you'd have to say about British farming today is that it's an industry going through unprecedented change. And those sort of words are bandied around a lot, but agriculture really is going through, I think, the biggest change since we domesticated plants and animals. So we're talking about prehistoric times, certainly much bigger than the changes, the post-war changes driven by, new machinery and, the green revolution with new fertilizers and pesticides and so on. And now obviously Brexit is in the UK is a big change driver at the moment. I personally think a lot of the changes that it's driving are ones that are it's more accelerating changes that were underway anyway. Things like the globalization, growing access to global markets, reductions in support payments. They're going to hit UK farmers a bit faster and harder than in other areas, but in all OECD countries, support payments to farmers are going down and moving more towards sort of away from straight direct payments and more towards environmental focused payments. Trade access to markets is a huge issue, and Brexit's going to have a big impact there. And I think the NFU's rightly focused on that as the biggest single thing to focus on. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But obviously other issues like access to labour and the regulatory regime we work under in farming, all of these things are up for grabs. If any one of those were sort of going through a dramatic change, that would be a big enough change driver. But all four of those accelerated by Brexit at the same time. That in itself is an enormous set of change. But on top of that, we've got the environmental drivers. We know now that we can't keep farming the way we have done. That period, the second half of the 20th century, from the Second World War till the turn of the century, bigger and bigger machines, more and more agrochemicals. We know we can't keep farming in that way. One of my first meetings with a farmer when I became the editor of Farmers Weekly with our farmer of the year at the time, who said to me, we have to stop fighting nature, we have to work with nature. And we're relearning things like smart crop rotations and so on. It's not just about sort of smart new things to do. Changing consumer demands. But I think new science and technology is also having a massive impact on agriculture. It's only just started. We're just seeing the beginning of it. But I think the next decade, we're going to see a lot of change driven by new science and technology developments coming into agriculture, whether that's the stuff that's hitting the headlines, like robots and automation. I'd lost count of how many times the small robot company's been on TV over the last year or so. But smart genetics, giving us better crops and livestock. New products, the ability to grow new things thanks to genetic modification of crops, and so there's some real sort of interesting left field things that sort of some of these genetic techniques hold out the option for. One that always gets me: why on earth do we put nitrogen fertilizer on crops? I mean, our crops are literally swimming in nitrogen. 78% of the air they're sitting in is nitrogen. So why do we spend a fortune putting nitrogen fertilizer on crops? And of course, they can't absorb N2 molecules. So, but with genetic techniques, we could genetically engineer plants like wheat so that they can do the same sort of things that legumes do and absorb nitrogen via the microbes in their roots. So, really interesting things that those sort of developments could drive. Our understanding of soil science has come on in leaps and bounds. Data analytics is going to have a huge impact on farming. There are some developments in science and technology that, whilst they're not going to be applied directly to farming themselves, are going to have a big impact on farming, or potentially could have a huge impact. So there's the amount of money now going into alternative protein sources. The first ones coming to market are the plant-based meat alternatives, but there's people like Jeff Bezos at Amazon investing a huge amount in things like cell-based meat. These could have a big impact on the market. And in a country where 60% of our agricultural revenue comes from livestock farming, if that starts to take off in the next decade, that could have a big impact on the UK. So I just reeled off a list, but just to show, I think this is absolutely unprecedented change. And if we take a long, hard look at British farming, British farmers are amongst the best in the world, no doubt. The best British farmers can stand alongside and hold their heads up high alongside any. But if you look across the board, overall, British farming could be in better shape. It's on average, it's often marginally profitable. The fact is there's a huge diversity. So the very top 25% doing very well, but at the bottom end, you've got a long tail of farmers that really struggle to sort of keep their heads above water. A lot of farms still depend on the support payments and diversification. So I think the change that we're seeing has huge opportunities for British farmers, but I think there's a general understanding now that we can't go on as we are. I'm not just talking about the environmental stuff. The way British farming is organised and operated now, if things around us are changing, the industry's got to change to remain successful. And some of those changes, again, this is stuff that we've been writing about in Farmers Weekly. We're not the only people writing about this. The need for more professionalisation of the industry, to treat it as a business, for effective innovation, a commitment every year that we're going to do better next year than we did the year before. The importance of using data to drive decisions. I don't know how you can measure innovation and know whether you're improving a business if you're not measuring what you're doing. How do you know if what you're doing next year is better than this year if you're not measuring? You don't know what it is you need to measure. What are the key things that are the key indicators of how your farm is performing? And then you're not measuring them to say, okay, this year I'm doing better than last year. And there's a need for a skills revolution, both to upgrade the skills on farm, because a lot of this new techniques and new tools coming into farming are going to be very demanding on farmers who are already, I think, have to have the widest set of skills of any sector in the UK. I can't think of any other role where you have to have such a wide range of skills to be successful. But with all of this change, it's going to get even harder. So I think there's a real need to upskill the existing workforce, but also bring in some people with new skills that in the past the industry didn't have, like data analytics, some of these new electronics techniques and so on, software engineering. Lots of new skills we'll need in agriculture that maybe historically we didn't. And it's got to appeal to people like me. I graduated in physics in 1983. And if you'd said to me back then, if you thought about agriculture as a career, Karl, I'd have looked at you as if you were mad. You might as well have suggested I go into knitting or something. I would have seen no way to apply my skills as a physicist to agriculture. And if I look at farming now, I think, bloody hell, if you had to pick one industry where new science and technology, the really exciting developments in science and technology are going to have the real biggest impact and affect real people's lives, I can't think of any sector where that's more true than agriculture. There's a real need at the moment for the industry to change its image, because that's not the way it's viewed. It's, if we're brutally honest, it's viewed from the outside as low skill, low tech, slow moving, and we need to address that. So this all sounds a bit doom and gloom. I'm actually really optimistic about British farming. So what are the positives? I think we are actually quite well placed. If you look at the direction that the world is heading in and the sort of farming that we need in the future, then actually UK has a lot of really positive aspects. One is that we've got some of the world's beating agricultural research centres, places like Rothamsted and the John Innes Centre and the James Hutton Institute. We have got people go on about bargaining, and actually, I've been there, I've talked to the professors, they're very smart people, but I'd still put some of our British research institutions above the Dutch. New technology is going to have a big impact on the industry, and Britain is the third biggest recipient of ag tech startup funding. US is number one, I think it's Israel number two, and the UK is the third biggest recipient. So we've got a really big sort of homegrown set of ag tech companies that are helping to transform the way we farm. And the UK brand is fantastic. That brand association with high quality, high welfare, the things which actually farmers are desperate to hold on to at the moment in the agriculture bill, and fighting the government to make sure we don't undermine those high standards. But I think they're really important for our future global success, because I think it was almost mandatory. Every farming related conference you go to, someone has to talk about the growing world population and the fact that this is going to drive more demand for food. But actually, I think a more interesting number isn't the absolute number of people is going to grow, but the size of the world's middle class, people who can afford to, who aren't just sort of scratching to get by, who have spare money and so can not just buy the basic food they need to eat, but can make a choice about what food they buy. That's growing much, much faster than the world population. One study I saw from the Brookings Institute said that between 2015 and 2030, the proportion of the world population that they classify as middle class, that's not what you and I would consider middle class. This is basically people who are living above subsistence level, who can actually make choices about how they spend their money, will grow from 40% to 64%. So, you know, I think the UK quality and high welfare, those sort of brand association that British farming has, potentially stands us in really good stead. A couple of things very quickly on sort of, I've talked about Brexit enough, I think, you know, about the ag bill. You know, that is a real challenge to the UK position, because, you know, in the changes in trade driven by Brexit, the real threat isn't largely our ability to export agricultural commodities outside, because frankly we're not very good at it. We don't do very much. There are some sectors like sheep, where I think we export 30% of all our sheep output. 90% of that goes to Europe. So that's a sector where, you know, exports are an issue. But for most UK farming, the real threat to changing trade deals is the threat to our home market and access to our market from outside for stuff that at the moment isn't allowed to come in here. And you know, the concern over the not writing into law that when we finally sort of break away from all the EU, the comfort blanket of the EU next year, that it's not written into law that we can't, you know, that you can't export goods that would be illegal to produce in the UK. It is very worrying. I think long term, you know, give the British farming a few years and it will be less of a concern. But you know, immediately after leaving the EU, I think that's a real threat. It's interesting. We saw just this week that the Trade and Agriculture Commission has been now put on a statutory footing. The government has conceded on that, and the farming unions quite rightly have been celebrating that fact. My concern is that actually that was a bit of a sideshow to hide the fact that in the same week, in fact last night, the government defeated the proposed amendment from Lord Branchester's Lord's amendment that would have actually written those UK standards into law and prevented food being imported that doesn't meet those standards. So I'm still very concerned about that. So sorry, that's sort of a lightning run through sort of some of the issues at the moment. What about Farmers Weekly? Well, I think if go thinking about what I've just said and about the scale of change that's happening, there's never been a more important time for farmers to have a reliable, trustworthy, truly independent source of information and advice. There's plenty of people looking to give farmers advice, but not many of them at all are doing it purely with the best interests of the farmer at heart. They generally have some other agenda. And you know, in a time of dramatic change, as we're starting to go through now, I think that's never more important. So Mark mentioned that one of the things we talk about a lot on Farmers Weekly is actionable content. And what we mean by that is that, you know, we are writing for a professional audience. A lot of the topics that we write about, you know, farming's quite sexy at the moment. So the national press and the TV and radio cover farming quite a bit. But when we cover farming, we're writing for an audience of people who are actually, you know, they've got skin in the game. They're getting their hands dirty. And we're not just writing out of interest. If you read an article on farming in The Guardian expects you to read it out of interest, but not to actually do anything with that information. Whereas everything we produce in Farmers Weekly, our expectation is our readers might want to act on this. So that drives everything that we do. The topics we cover, we need to focus on the topics that can make the most difference to farmers. What we include in the information we include, it's not good enough just to say what's happening. You have to give that extra information to help your readers understand, what does it mean for me and what are my options? What can I do about this? And even down to the way we structure what we produce and the way we present and lay it out. everything is driven by that driver that we need to make this actionable. Our expectations that people aren't just going to read this and walk away. They're going to read it because they might want to do something about it. And so I think interwoven with that, and equally important as that sort of focus on making our content actionable, is maintaining independence and integrity. This is, our own industry, publishing, has gone through unprecedented change in the last 10, 20 years. I've been through. I was editorial development director at RBI when the web revolution was first sort of hitting, and working out how we were going to respond, and what does it mean for journalism in a world where you're connected to all your readers through the screen, and they can interact with you as well as you publishing to them. It's made dramatic changes to our industry, and it's often made it very hard for us to keep that clear line of what does editorial integrity mean in a world like that? What does editorial independence and strength mean in a world like that? So we take quite a hard line on that, and we think it's not good enough just to be whiter than white, to genuinely be independent. We have to go out of our way to show to our readers that we're independent, because there are plenty of sources of information out there that, while they might look on the surface to be independent, actually aren't. And so one of the things that we take a very hard line on is that we don't accept PR written content. All of our content is created by our team or commissioned by them from freelancers, many of you guys, we sometimes use some expert content from vets or accountants or people with particular technical or sort of industry expertise. But if you see something in Farmers Weekly, you've got to be able to know that this is written by someone or briefed by someone who is thinking purely what matters to farmers, what information can we give to farmers that is most valuable to them and is genuinely untarnished, not written with another agenda in mind. We never concede editorial control. One of the big changes in our industry has been when I first became a journalist, there was a clear line between advertising and editorial, and never the twain shall meet. Now we do a lot of sponsored projects, and that you've got to tread a very fine line there when you do that. How do you make sure that you do that without ceding any control? So we have very, very strict rules that anything we produce in Farmers Week, we're happy for people to help support. If we want to do some research that we couldn't afford to do just with our editorial budget, or organise events and things that help us, that help us generate great content, we're happy for people to sponsor them, and they can have the brand association. But the control of the content, what we write, is entirely always in our hands. And that's sometimes a hard line to hold, but we take a really, really tight line on that. Now, when COVID hit, if you'd said to me beforehand, Karl, with 2 days' notice, your entire team, everyone, the journalists, the ad team, the marketing team, the events people, everyone can't come into the office. They're all going to be working from home. We've got a pretty good team, so I thought they'd have done a pretty good job. But I've been astonished at how well we've working from home. So we've got nearly 60 people on Farmers Weekly, all now working from home. I was in the office actually yesterday for a meeting, and we had 2 other people apart from me and the sort of management team of Farmers Weekly in the office. And actually the fact that I don't think we would have managed nearly as well if this had happened 10 years ago. The technology, this technology we're using now, Zoom, we use Microsoft Teams. That's made a huge difference. And we were already using Microsoft Teams before the COVID crisis struck. So I think that really helped us, partly because we have people who work remotely anyway. So we've had to learn how to work in teams of people that aren't all in the same place. But the team has risen to the challenge brilliantly. We've suddenly couldn't do any farm visits. It put an immediate break on events. I'm almost surprised myself to say we have actually managed to run 2 events, face-to-face events, during the whole crisis. One was Farmers Apprentice. I hope you were all following Farmers Apprentice last week on Facebook and YouTube, and Britain's Fittest Farmer. And again, it was a fantastic achievement to run an event that had, I think, over 100 people involved in total in an environment where we weren't allowed to have groups of more than 6 people meeting in one place. So that was a real logistical nightmare organising it under those restrictions, but the team managed to do it. I think what I've been most excited about, and I'm most proud of actually from the team, is the new things that we've done to make up for the fact that we couldn't do events. So, I mean, one of the huge successes has been the Farmers Weekly podcast. I know Johan is in the meeting today, and if you haven't listened to the Farmers Weekly podcast, I really urge you to do it. It's fantastic quality. The content is great. The technical quality is really, really good. And that's gone from strength to strength. I mean, I'm probably behind the times now. The last numbers I saw, we were getting more than 10,000 downloads a month, but it's growing really fast. And we're looking at ways now we can expand on that success because those podcasts are going so well. We've also, like everyone else, been doing lots of webinars and other virtual events. We're working in partnership. I mean, one of the struggles is how do you take stuff that we'd already planned, that we'd planned as a face-to-face event, how do you take that virtual? There was something we did last year in partnership with New Scientist at the New Scientist Live event, which was hugely successful. We ran a big stand around the future of food and farming with loads of partners from industry aiming to promote farming positively and challenge some of the myths to the sort of wider public, sort of the science literate public. And we were planning to do it on a much, much bigger scale this year. And of course, with COVID, we couldn't do that. But we're doing it now as a virtual event. And we've got, the John Innes Centre involved, and Harper Adams University, and the RAU, and the NFU, and John Deere, and dozens and dozens of organisations working with us, all working together. Actually, often competitive organisations working together to work out how can we do as good a job as possible to overcome some of these myths about farming. That it is low tech, low skill. That if you read the national press at the moment, you'd be forgiven for thinking the farmer is entirely responsible for climate change, and we're destroying the soil, and the food we produce is killing everyone. So overturning some of those negative myths about farming, and we're going to have to do that whole thing virtual. So watch out for that. That's happening at the end of this month. And we've also launched, I mean, this was something that was in train already before COVID, but we've sort of accelerated some of them, launched a whole bunch of new services for our readers alongside our journalism. So things like our energy saving service, we've launched a grain trading service just last month in partnership with GrainDex. So, actually, the lockdown for us hasn't been a period when we've just sort of dragged a rock over our heads and hope for it all to go away. We've actually done loads and loads of new things, and I can't praise the Farmers Weekly team enough. They've really sort of rolled up their sleeves and risen to the challenge. And as Mark hinted, the commercial results have been astonishing. So our subscriptions are actually ahead of where we thought they'd be pre-COVID. So we're beating our budget on subscriptions. Our news trade, some publications I saw, their news trade sales went down 50%. Ours at the worst were only down just over 10%, and we're now back up to where we expected them to be. And our advertising is bang on budget as well. So given the scale of the crisis and how some sectors are being affected, Farmers Weekly has really sort of risen to that challenge. I think I don't want to get too Churchillian, but I did say to the team a couple of months ago that looking back on this, I think we might look on this as our finest hour. I could ramble on, but I think I'll end there and see if there are any questions.
Chairman, can I ask a question? Karl, what's the sort of trend with the print versus online readership? Are there any trends you could just talk a little bit about, please?
Obviously, the online readership is massively bigger than the print readership because your reach online is so much greater. So as Mark said, we've got 26,000 subscribers and another 15,000 or so new regular news trade buyers. So we're over 40,000 on total circulation of print. On our website, we average, I think it's about 600,000 visitors, over more than double that, so well over 1 million visits. And page views, we sometimes go to close to 3 million page views in a month. So, those numbers are just massive compared to the print. And one of the and you know, our online audience is, you know, it wobbles up and down depending on what's going on in the year and whether there are things that are particularly interesting in the news that drive a lot of visits. But there's a general trend upwards on the online traffic. One of the things that there has been a trend on, it's something we've actively driven, is if you went back 4 years, almost all of the traffic on our site was on news content. And that's largely because if you go to almost all publishing websites and you either look at the homepage or you look at a particular page, the livestock section or the arable section, all the content is organized in reverse chronological order. So if something isn't fairly new, it's not there. And for news, it's got to be recent. If something's a week old, or, you know, certainly a month or a year old, then it's not news anymore. So that sort of the reverse chronological structure makes sense for news. But for more in-depth content, so best practice, case studies, guides to doing things, you know, rules and regulations about something, but, you know, you want to access that when you're doing the task, when you need it, not just because it happens to have been written that day or that week. So we had a feeling that we've got all of this high value content that isn't news, that has more longer shelf life, but because of the structure of our website, you didn't find it. I mean, you could do a search on it, but even if you did a search on a term, because we do so much news, it's sort of all the sort of in-depth high value stuff is sort of swamped by all the news. So we created our new know-how centers, getting on for 3 years ago now, and that has driven a big change. So if you went back 3 or 4 years ago and said, listed in any given week, what are the top 10 articles viewed on FWI, they would all have been news articles. Now, you know, some of those other ones would have built up. If you said over the last year what got the most views, then some of those longer shelf life ones, because the news ones go up and down very quickly, and the longer shelf life, by definition, are there for a longer time. But all of the in a given week, they were all the top ones would have been news stories. That's not the case now, and it's actually quite common for the top performing article in a week to be an in-depth one, maybe one that wasn't even written that week, that was written a few weeks ago, but suddenly is relevant because of what's going on now, because of the season and so on. And that's a really interesting change. It sort of suggests there's a change in the way people are using the website. You know, I think in the past, what was largely going on in our readers' heads when they came to our website was, what's going on? I just want to know what's going on. I've not got a particular agenda. Whereas now it suggests more of them are using the site as well as that, but to say, I'm doing a particular thing. I need to deal with mastitis in my herd, or I'm thinking about buying my neighbour's farm, or I've got to deal with this succession problem. And they're coming to the website looking for help on a particular topic. And we've consciously made that a lot easier by restructuring the site to do that. Sorry, it's a very long answer to a very short and concise question.
That's very good. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just if I can add another question on the same sort of theme, on the sort of online use of Farmers Weekly. I remember going back sort of 3 editors, the pain in sort of trying to extract money from British farmers to get online content. How does that go now? Are these people who've got full subscriptions, or a mixture of print and online, or what do people actually sort of tend to be buying at the moment?
It's so my gut feel is most people still pay their subscription when they're paying the subscription to Farmers Weekly. They see most of the value being in the print magazine rather than the website. But it's hard. We can't tell from the numbers, because if you buy a subscription to Farmers Weekly magazine, you get pretty much complete access to the website. So you get both. You can subscribe effectively just to the website, and that's a cheaper option. And some people do that. But that doesn't mean that the people who are subscribing to both are only buying the magazine. You know, they're getting the website, but there's just no way of us telling in their heads what proportion of that value, when they're handing over the money, they're attributing to the magazine and the website. But we've got a significant, it's in the thousands now, number of people subscribing to the web only proposition. And of course that's, you know, for people outside the UK. I mean, we've got, the last time I looked, we had 43 subscribers in New Zealand who wait a month to get their copy of Farmers Weekly. I'm assuming these are all expats who just want to sort of keep, like the feel of being in touch still with the old country. But obviously that's not a great experience reading your magazine a month late. So for people like that, having the web subscription is a really strong proposition.
Thank you.
Can I have one? Yeah. Carl and Mark, really.
Hello, Tim. Hi, Isabel.
Hello.
Hiya.
I sort of always remember a former editor of Farmers Weekly, Stephen Howe, once saying, when he was asked about who Farmers Weekly's competition was, he said, it's Farmers Guardian, it's only Farmers Guardian, and that's all you've got to think about. I'm just very conscious now that a lot of companies in the ag sector communicate directly with their own customers. The government puts out news information. Farmers talk to each other, fantastically well on social media. Given Farmers Weekly's sort of current business model, almost who's the biggest competition to what you guys do?
All of the above, Tim. You're absolutely right. The changes in technology and the way publishing has changed over the last 20 years has massively expanded the amount of competition. If you classify, from a reader point of view, from a subscriber point of view, if you classify as competition any other sources of news and information for farmers, then all of the ones you've described and others. There are lots of web-only publishing services. Social media is it's still, you can over-egg it. There's still a sizable chunk of farmers that don't regularly use social media, but it's become a really important source of information. And I think, we don't try and replace all of those and do everything. I think you just got to be really clear. What is it that we can do really well and better than all of these other things? So, that sort of conversational aspect of social media, things like Twitter and Facebook are brilliant at that. And, Farmers Weekly in the past might have attempted to replicate that and do it. So we ran our own forums. But you both will remember not that long ago running our own forums. And I think we quite rightly, I remember having conversations with you, Tim, about this. I think we quite rightly decided with the growth of social media, that's now not something that we can really add value on. Social media does a really good job at that. So let's step back and focus on what we can do really well. But I think that the things that we can make a real difference on are that being that trusted independent source of information, because there's plenty of good stuff on social media, but there's plenty of rubbish as well. Some of it's rubbish just because people don't know what they're talking about. Some of it's rubbish because they know what they're talking about and they're consciously trying to mislead. And I think being a trusted source of information is something that Farmers Weekly really can add value. And I'll give you an example, and it's still one of my favorite stories. It's a few years old now. A few years ago, we got a press release sent to us, and the headline was something like, and I won't name names, but Company X, which made a colostrum replacement supplement, comes out top in Cambridge University research of all the colostrum supplement replacements. And that press release was run pretty much like that, with pretty much the same headline on lots of places. I remember seeing it being published. Farmers Weekly didn't run that story because our journalists phoned up the researchers at Cambridge and talked to them and grilled them a bit about what the research was about. And they found that whilst it was true that Company X's colostrum supplement had more of the active ingredients that the lambs need than any of the other colostrum replacements, none of them had anything like the proportion of those active ingredients that real colostrum from a ewe had. And so the real message for farmers was, don't use any of them. So the first choice is to go with the mother's colostrum. If you can't get that, get some from another ewe. But actually, you're doing more harm than good. If you fill those lambs' stomachs with that low quality colostrum supplement, they satiate their appetite and yet don't get enough of those active ingredients. And it stops them eating the stuff that's much higher value. So that's the story we wrote. Now, we got a lot of stick from the company. It was also an advertiser in Farmers Weekly. A lot of public, that's where we can really add value. You're not going to get a press release with that story on it. You're not going to, PRs aren't going to be pushing those stories on social media. something like that is something that Farmers Weekly, digging underneath the headlines, understanding what the truth is and telling it unvarnished to farmers, whether or not there's a short-term hit to us, which there was. That advertiser stopped advertising for a bit, though they came back later on. I think that's the sort of thing that Farmers Weekly can really add value.
I mean, if I could just add a couple of sentences to that. I'm not a great believer in looking at competition. I hope this doesn't sound complacent, because I think that what you have to do is believe in what you're doing. And if you're doing your own job, then that should be good enough. Concentrate what you're doing. There's so many people in magazine publishing that are so terrified of their publishing, they find it very hard to make proper decisions. If I give just one sort of example, when we bought Gramophone, which has been around since 1923, when I was their kind of rates, subscription rates were very, very low. And when I asked the publisher at Haymarket why they didn't put up their rates, they said that's absolutely impossible because we're competing with BBC Music Magazine. And yet it's actually not competition, because what Gramophone is doing is very different from BBC Music Magazine. So I went away, I did, and all I said to all our teams was focus on what we can do. In fact, what we then decided to do was we put up all our rates, which we did because they were very low, and we introduced a club rate. So if you're actually a member of Gramophone, and similar thinking might govern how we respond to Farmers Week as well. So if you're actually a club member, you can actually get the print edition, which is a lot more expensive. It used to be in Haymarket. You can get the online edition, and you can get the database. So you can actually subscribe to all three. So instead of the cost of a individual, and we don't discriminate between print and online, exactly the same rate. It's your choice. If you want it online, have it online, but it's the same rate. The content's the same or similar. But if you are a club member, you can subscribe to all those three packages for £99. Now, I haven't looked at a single copy of BBC Music Magazine since we've acquired Farmers Weekly. All I know is what Farmers Weekly, Gramophone, I mean, all I know is that Gramophone is twice as profitable as it used to be when it was in the last few years of Haymarket. So I apply the same thing. I'm not overtly interested in what our competition is doing. I'm interested in what we can do. And if we focus on what we can do and do better, then I think that there's a very big market for us.
That's great. Are there any other questions? Francis.
You said about how your 60 staff suddenly had to start working from home, and you praised them for doing that. Do you see them coming back to the office, or is this working from home going to be a long-term trend?
Ask me in a few months' time. I've always been. I had my fingers burnt early on in my career as an editor. When I took over as editor of Computer Weekly, 20 odd years ago now, I inherited a couple of staff who were working remotely, and it wasn't structured very well, and they weren't the sort of people who were suited to work in that way, and it didn't work really well, and it took me a long time to sort that out. So that sort of scarred me a bit. So I've always been a bit of a skeptic, and have, when that situation has come up where people have requested sort of flexible working or working from home, the two things I've always said are, you need to convince me that A, you've got the processes in place so that the things that need to happen happen, not automatically as they do in the office when you're all bumping into each other, but when you're working remotely. And secondly, that the people involved are the sort of people who can work in that way. It involves, a lot more sort of managing your own time, and no one's looking over your shoulder. But I have to say, and I think the technology has made a difference. It has come along in leaps and bounds, but I am much more amenable to it now. And it certainly, I could see some commercial advantages for us. If I look at Farmers Weekly, if you want to work in agricultural journalism, it's great to be at Farmers Weekly because if you're going to want to work there, most people would like to work at Farmers Weekly. But we're sort of not far from London. We're just sort of south of London, and not many people want to live. You know, if you're an agricultural journalist, most agricultural journalists want to live out in the countryside, don't want to live in the suburbs of London. So that's always been one of the challenges of hiring staff and holding on to staff, is that, you know, they want to move out. You know, just talking to Tim and Isabel a little while ago, you know, they've moved out into the rural idyll where they now live. So a lot of the freelancers actually who we use are former staff of Farmers Weekly who moved away from London and went freelance. So I think having a bit more flexibility and having teams that don't have to be based all the time in the office could actually help us in terms of recruiting and holding on to people for a bit longer than we would otherwise. So I'm not, you know, we're not. It's not going to be a free for all, and you know, we're going to go back to the office. We're not going to abandon the office for good. But I would envisage, you know, perhaps you should ask Mark this, because, you know, he's my boss at the end of the day. But my view is that I think it's shown us that we can work really well remotely. So I think I'm inclined to be a bit more flexible and a bit more welcoming of sort of remote working now than I was before.
Yeah, do you want me to say just a couple of comments? I mean, I think that what is happening is that, you know, I grew up in a kind of structure. You know, you're 5 minutes late for work and you get a ticking off. So that was the environment that I grew up. And I think you've got to move away from that type of environment to an environment of trust. And so and I think what will happen is there'll be some kind of patchwork, a hybrid system. You know, half the week might be at home, half the week might be in the office, and that will depend very much on local circumstances. I do think, though, it's very, very hard to get people back to the office. I mean, our main office in South London, we normally have 220 people working there. Last week or the week before, we had 5. And, you know, I think that in the long run, there will be consequences if we can't get more people coming back to the office at vital times. You know, if you want to have team meetings, I mean, we can do it over Zoom, but Zoom has its kind of, or Teams has its limitation. And there are times when you're, you know, talking about strategy, you want to have people in one room. So I think the challenge is going to be trying to get people back to work in the office at certain times, but allowing them to have the flexibility of working from home. And that's going to be a delicate balance. And I think that the longer this virus goes on, then it gets harder and harder to get people working, you know, back in the office. And that's going to be a challenge.
Thank you. I would agree with that. I think personally, I think the difficulty is going to come because these are all seasoned campaigners who knew what they were doing. When you have new staff joining who might not be so familiar with how to do things.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, you know, we've not had any new staff joining in from outside during the lockdown period, you know, since March. I think that would have been a lot harder, you know, introducing a new person into the team when we're not in the office. That would have been quite hard, actually.
Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions? Oh. Fine, thank you. Mark and Karl, that was amazing. Thank you very much for your time. And thanks very much for giving your views and experience from 2 very different backgrounds. We very much appreciate it. I just marked down just 2 or 3 words that seemed to bleed from both of you as you were talking, and they were dedication to yourself and your colleagues and your business and the industry. The other one was absolute passion. You could feel it coming out that screen. Trust, you used the word trust just a few moments ago. And the final word was personal. This is personal for you. And this is one-to-one. And you made tonight's presentation feel as though you were talking to each one of us individually. So thank you for that. I think it's been a tremendous night, and I think we've all gathered a lot of value from your views. And Mark, thank you very much for joining the industry. It's great. Great.
Thank you very much, Paul, and I hope I have the chance to get to know you as well. And thanks very much for the fantastic work that you and your guild do. And you know, I hope I have the chance of meeting you. And I do appreciate your invitation. And as I say, if I'm elected a member, I'll be very pleased to play my part.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I have to say, having worked in lots of sectors, the guild in the agricultural journalism sector, there's no other sector that's got as strong and vibrant an organisation for journalists working in the sector as we've got in agriculture, and it's a real boon for journalists.
Okay.
That's great. Have you anything to add, Liz? Are you happy now? Anything to add? Yeah, good.
Thank you, Paul.
Right. Then I'll say thank you all for joining us. Hope that was useful. Thank you, Mark and Karl, for joining us. And we hope the Guild hopes to see you soon again. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Bye.